The atmosphere inside the grandiose, historic, and physically imposing marble-lined chamber of the Joint Economic Committee was practically vibrating with a thick, almost physically suffocating layer of anticipated tension, long before the presiding chairman ever stepped up to strike the first ceremonial blow of his heavy wooden gavel. It was a crisp, typically brisk Tuesday morning out on the sprawling, meticulously manicured green lawns of Washington District of Columbia. The autumn air outside was sharp, biting, and relentlessly cold against the faces of the arriving staffers. But inside this particular heavily guarded committee room, the political temperature was already boiling over into entirely dangerous, unprecedented territory. The historic corridors of the United States Capitol building, with their echoing stone floors, towering limestone columns, and sweeping archways, had been aggressively buzzing for several consecutive days with the highly publicized, universally acknowledged knowledge that a major, globally recognized banking executive was being hauled in to testify under the unforgiving weight of a federal oath. This elite financial titan was summoned to answer directly to the American people regarding the ongoing catastrophic regional financial crisis and the crippling, relentless waves of historic inflation that were currently sweeping mercilessly across every single time zone, every rural zip code, and every economic demographic in the nation. However, the true undeniable spectacle of the morning was absolutely not the frightened corporate executive himself, nor was it the dense, impenetrable volumes of macroeconomic data waiting to be debated by the various subcommittees. The real draw, the absolute epicenter of the political hurricane about to make landfall, was the specific legendary lawmakers waiting ominously on the elevated wooden dais. Everyone packed tightly into the sprawling press gallery, from seasoned, deeply cynical political correspondents who had witnessed decades of Washington's theatrical grandstanding to eager, wide-eyed junior reporters covering their very first major committee assignment, knew perfectly well that Representative Maxine Waters had prepared exhaustively for this exact high-stakes moment. She had spent the entirety of her preceding weekend deliberately and aggressively telegraphing her combative intentions on multiple national television broadcasts and highly rated Sunday morning talk shows. She had made it abundantly, terrifyingly clear to anyone who would listen to her rapid-fire interviews that she fully intended to absolutely dismantle the corporate banking sector on live, unedited national broadcasting, leaving nothing but rhetorical ash in her wake. The overwhelming, unprecedented media presence in the massive room perfectly reflected this massive, widespread public anticipation. 3 solid, unbroken rows of heavy, highly sophisticated television cameras were locked securely onto their steel tripods at the very back of the vaulted chamber, their glowing red recording lights ready to blink synchronously into action the absolute second the official microphones went live. Boom. Operators adjusted their sensitive audio levels. Network producers whispered frantically into the earpieces of their television anchors, and veteran print journalists sat completely still with their premium pens poised over yellow legal pads, entirely ready to capture the inevitable verbal fireworks. The public seating area was completely saturated, filled well beyond its official maximum fire code capacity with a restless, constantly shifting sea of concerned everyday citizens, highly nervous corporate lobbyists wearing exorbitantly expensive custom-tailored suits and whispering political aides who were pressed tightly, shoulder to shoulder against the wooden railings. This sheer volume of human bodies, combined with the intense glare of the broadcasting lights, created a stifling, uncomfortable, and inescapable layer of body heat in the confined historic space, making the very air feel incredibly heavy and difficult to breathe. Up on the elevated, highly polished mahogany dais, looking down upon the crowded, anxious floor like supreme judges sitting at a grand, unforgiving tribunal, the visual and energetic contrast between the two key political figures could not have been more dramatically, almost comically striking. On the far left side of the sweeping curved platform, Representative Maxine Waters sat with the rigid, perfectly straight, and unyielding posture of a seasoned, battle-hardened military general actively preparing to order a ruthless frontal charge against a deeply entrenched enemy line. She was dressed in a vibrant, sharply tailored blazer that commanded immediate visual attention from every lens in the room, her physical posture projecting a distinct aura of absolute, uncompromising, and terrifying authority. Her hands were already resting dangerously close to the heavy wooden-sounding block of her parliamentary gavel, her fingers drumming a silent, highly impatient, and rhythmic beat on the polished wood. Her eyes were constantly scanning the bustling room below her with a sharp, piercing, and predatory intensity that dared absolutely anyone to challenge her ultimate dominance over the morning's proceedings. She radiated a kinetic, practically volcanic energy, appearing entirely ready and explicitly eager to unleash decades of practiced, devastating rhetorical fury. She was a recognized master of the congressional soundbite, a veteran political brawler who understood the exact acoustic geometry of a viral internet moment better than almost anyone else in the entire legislative branch. Far over on the exact opposite side of that very same elevated platform, separated by several empty leather seats and an entire vast universe of opposing political philosophy, Senator John Neely Kennedy presented a picture of almost unsettling, profound relaxation. He was slumped deeply and incredibly comfortably into the soft, yielding padding of his high-backed leather chair, his posture suggesting a man who had entirely all the time in the world and absolutely nowhere else he needed to be. His wire-rimmed reading glasses were pushed far down the bridge of his nose in a manner that seemed entirely unbothered by the historic weight of the morning's gathering. He looked significantly less like a powerful, internationally recognized federal legislator who held the economic fate of the nation in his hands, and much more like a weary, highly observant Southern gentleman waiting patiently for a severely delayed freight train on a sweltering summer afternoon in the deepest, quietest parts of Louisiana. He did not actively scan the anxious crowd with predatory eyes, nor did he frantically shuffle through massive, brightly color-coded binders of highlighted macroeconomic policy documents like the highly anxious, profusely sweating junior colleague seated immediately beside him. He did not surround himself with an army of eager young staffers frantically handing him talking points written on index cards. Instead, resting directly in front of him on the highly polished wooden surface of the committee table, fully illuminated by the harsh overhead lighting, there was only one single, incredibly diminutive and entirely unremarkable object. It was a thin, thoroughly crumpled, and slightly torn piece of cheap thermal paper that looked exactly like a discarded grocery store receipt salvaged hastily from the bottom of an old, forgotten coat pocket. It sat there, tiny, fragile, and completely ignored by everyone in the massive room, looking entirely out of place among the thick leather portfolios, sleek digital tablets, and heavy black microphones dominating the rest of the intimidating parliamentary setup. It was a piece of literal, everyday trash resting quietly on the grand altar of American political power. When the presiding committee chairman finally cleared his throat, leaned heavily into his microphone, and struck the gavel to officially call the chaotic morning session to order, the ambient noise in the massive room instantly evaporated into a dead absolute silence. He formally granted Representative Waters her specifically allocated window of time to speak, and the shift in the room's energy was instantaneous and absolutely electric. Every single camera lens in the back of the room universally pivoted on its mechanical axis to frame her face tightly. She did not bother to ease into her line of questioning with polite, customary introductions or hollow legislative pleasantries. She launched her offensive immediately, striking with the sheer, undeniable, and crushing force of a heavy steel battering ram breaching a fortress gate, staring directly down from her elevated perch at the deeply nervous, heavily perspiring banking chief executive seated all alone at the solitary witness table in the center of the floor. She initiated a brutal, uncompromising, and highly public interrogation. She began a highly rhythmic, pounding, and heavily rehearsed monologue detailing the gross, unprecedented, and historically massive accumulation of corporate wealth during a deeply painful, agonizing economic period when ordinary, Hardworking Americans were desperately struggling just to keep their electricity turned on and their families adequately fed. She painted a vivid, merciless, and terrifyingly accurate picture of unchecked Wall Street greed, utilizing her powerful, resonant voice to fill every single corner of the echoing marble chamber. She described astronomical executive bonus packages that literally rivaled the gross domestic product of small, developing nations. She outlined predatory lending practices specifically designed by financial algorithms to keep the working poor in a perpetual, inescapable state of generating interest debt. She loudly condemned massive corporate stock buybacks that aggressively enriched isolated shareholders and board members while entirely ignoring the devastating daily plight of the average American consumer who could no longer afford basic necessities. Absolute, unfiltered, and highly concentrated venom laced every single syllable of her commanding voice. The executive, a man highly accustomed to effortlessly commanding massive, intimidating corporate boardrooms in Manhattan and aggressively dictating financial terms to volatile global markets, found himself completely, hopelessly outmatched. In this specific congressional arena, his vast personal wealth and his long list of impressive corporate titles offered him absolutely zero defensive protection. He physically shrank back into the expensive leather of his witness seat under the intense, blistering heat of her relentless, perfectly articulated public accusation. He reached for his glass of ice water with a slightly noticeably trembling hand. His highly paid, exceptionally credentialed defense attorneys sitting uselessly in the row directly behind him were entirely paralyzed, entirely unable to shield their lucrative client from the relentless verbal onslaught raining down from the dais. When the executive finally mustered the fragile, desperate courage to attempt a polite, legally necessary interjection, nervously opening his mouth to utter a complex defense, heavily wrapped in complicated macroeconomic terminology, dense regulatory jargon, and carefully vetted legal phrasing, Waters immediately brought her hand down with ferocious, heavily practiced speed. She did not simply interrupt him with a standard polite legislative objection, as is customary in committee hearings. She aggressively deployed the exact famous procedural phrase that had successfully made her a viral sensation across the digital internet for years. Reclaiming my time, she snapped, her voice ringing out incredibly sharp, loud, and absolute, cutting through the cavernous vaulted room like a sudden deafening gunshot. The executive blinked rapidly in pure shock, his mouth hanging completely open for a fraction of a second. He stammered incoherently, utterly derailed by the sheer unapologetic force of the interruption, and desperately tried to restart his complicated, heavily rehearsed sentence from a slightly different analytical angle, desperately hoping to find a sliver of daylight in her suffocating argument. "Reclaiming my time," Waters repeated, significantly louder and much more forceful this time, accompanied by a sharp, highly authoritative and violently echoing tap of her wooden gavel directly onto the sounding block. The sharp, concussive crack of the wood reverberated aggressively off the marble walls, serving as a physical, undeniable manifestation of her absolute, total control over the hearing. She utilized this specific parliamentary procedural rule not merely as a standard, boring mechanism to actively manage her allotted ticking clock on the wall, but as a highly calculated, devastatingly effective psychological weapon. She was methodically, purposefully, and entirely publicly stripping the incredibly wealthy witness of his voice, his public dignity, and his fundamental ability to defend his entire sprawling, highly lucrative industry. Every single time he attempted to introduce nuance, context, or a counter-argument, she slammed the heavy iron door shut in his face with those three simple, unyielding words. She commanded the massive chamber flawlessly, successfully building a towering, impenetrable narrative fortress that explicitly cast the wealthy financial elite as the sole, malicious architects of the nation's severe economic misery. Simultaneously, she positioned herself perfectly for the cameras as the ultimate, impenetrable, and purely righteous shield of the forgotten working class. She spoke passionately, gesturing broadly and dramatically with her hands, of historic, systemic injustices, of deliberate financial exclusion, explicitly targeting marginalized minority neighborhoods, and of an entire economic system fundamentally, deliberately, and irrevocably rigged against the working poor from its very historical foundation. By the time the glowing digital clock on the wall, signaling her allotted minutes, finally expired and flashed a bright, unforgiving red zero, she had successfully sucked absolutely all the breathable oxygen out of the massive room. Her fiercely loyal supporters, packed tightly into the public gallery, were nodding their heads vigorously in unified, passionate agreement, some even murmuring quiet, audible words of affirmation, despite the strict rules of decorum. The political reporters in the front rows were frantically typing out her most aggressive quotes on their laptops, knowing with absolute unshakable certainty that these specific, fiery, and perfectly delivered sound bites were guaranteed to completely dominate the evening television news cycles from coast to coast. Waters leaned back slowly into her tall leather chair, taking a deep, highly satisfying breath. Her facial expression radiated a sense of absolute, unquestioned, and total political triumph. She had expertly set the stage, she had played her assigned part to absolute, flawless perfection, and she firmly believed, without a shadow of a doubt, that she exclusively owned the entire narrative of the day. However, the fundamental nature of congressional hearings dictates that the parliamentary floor must eventually, inevitably shift. The glowing red microphone activation light eventually passed slowly down the long, curved wooden desk, officially transferring the parliamentary floor from one member to the next. It navigated past several junior senators who asked highly forgettable, entirely dry questions about abstract interest rate yields and dense regulatory frameworks until it finally quietly illuminated the small, fragile bulb positioned directly in front of Senator John Neely Kennedy. The subsequent transition in tone, pacing, and energetic frequency was so incredibly jarring and absolute that it felt exactly like watching a dramatic, high-speed action film suddenly and inexplicably switch into a slow, methodically paced, deeply character-driven Southern Gothic drama without any warning whatsoever. Kennedy did not immediately begin to speak. He allowed the heavy silence to stretch, purposefully forcing the highly agitated room to adjust to his own personal unhurried rhythm. He took a long, incredibly slow, and highly deliberate breath, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses with agonizing, unhurried deliberation, and leaned his body forward slowly toward the black mesh of the microphone. When his voice finally echoed quietly through the state-of-the-art sound system, it was completely and utterly devoid of the righteous, burning, and explosive anger that had just powerfully flooded the room moments before. Instead, it was a thick, exceptionally slow, molasses-sweet Louisiana drawl that sounded entirely casual and deeply, almost uncomfortably intimate and conversational. He did not look down at the heavily sweating banking executive. In fact, he completely ignored the presence of the powerful witness entirely, treating the billionaire CEO as if he were an entirely invisible entity in the room. Instead, he looked out straight over the heads of the massive, attentive crowd, tilting his head slightly as if he were comfortably addressing an old, familiar friend standing quietly in the far back corner of the room, completely bypassing the Washington elite to speak directly into the camera lenses, broadcasting to the living rooms of America. He began to tell a story. He formally introduced the highly educated, incredibly wealthy room to a completely unknown man named Earl. Earl, Kennedy explained, in his exceptionally steady, unhurried, and rhythmic cadence, was an independent, hardworking plumber living in the sweltering, deeply oppressive humidity of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Kennedy did not rush the details. He meticulously described Earl's grueling, entirely unglamorous daily routine, ensuring the audience could practically see the sweat on the man's brow. He detailed exactly how Earl woke up hours before the sun ever breached the horizon, the deep, chronic physical ache in his lower back serving as a constant, painful companion after decades of crawling under muddy houses to fix broken pipes. He described Earl packing a battered, dented metal lunchbox with whatever meager leftovers were left in the refrigerator and driving a 15-year-old, heavily rusted work truck that desperately needed a new transmission. He simply mathematically could not afford to buy on his current wages. Representative Waters, seated far down the completely opposite end of the long dais, visibly and aggressively bristled at this sudden, highly dramatic departure from the intense, aggressive financial interrogation she had just masterminded and executed with such flawless precision. She sighed incredibly loudly into the open air, a sharp sound easily picked up by the sensitive microphones surrounding her. She shifted her weight aggressively in her chair, crossing her arms tightly across her chest, and conspicuously raised her arm high to check her gold wristwatch, projecting an unmistakable, highly visible, and deeply dismissive signal of her profound impatience and absolute disdain for the slow, meandering Southern story currently unfolding. She wanted to debate corporate taxation algorithms. He was talking about a completely irrelevant plumber in Louisiana. But Kennedy completely and utterly ignored her highly visible visual cues and her palpable radiating frustration. He methodically continued painting the highly detailed, deeply emotional picture of Earl, deliberately slowing his chosen words down even further to ensure every single syllable carried maximum, devastating weight into the historical record. He explained precisely how Earl had recently pulled his exhausted, rattling truck up to a local, rundown gas station just off the interstate after a brutal 14-hour shift. Kennedy described how Earl felt a genuine, terrifying physical panic attack slowly creeping into his chest, tightening his lungs like a vice. He described how Earl stood there in the suffocating southern heat and watched the glowing digital numbers on the fuel pump spin higher and significantly faster than they ever had in his entire hard-working life. The rapidly escalating numbers were a blur, entirely disconnected from the harsh, unyielding reality of his hourly wage. Kennedy meticulously described the rough, calloused, and deeply cracked texture of Earl's heavily scarred hands as he gripped the dirty, heavy fuel nozzle, standing completely alone in the oppressive weather. He described Earl agonizingly wondering which essential, life-sustaining utility bill he was going to be forced to skip paying that exact month just to afford the exorbitant cost of the gasoline required to drive his truck to his next plumbing job. Was it going to be the electricity bill keeping the lights on? The water bill? The desperately needed, highly expensive prescription medication for his ailing wife? The room, which had been buzzing with such aggressive, combative, and purely partisan political energy just a few short minutes before, began to fundamentally, noticeably change its entire composition. The frantic reporters completely stopped typing on their keyboards. The highly paid lobbyists stopped whispering strategic advice to their wealthy clients. The entire vast chamber began to settle into a very strange, deeply confused, and highly, almost painfully attentive quiet. Kennedy was not shouting, he was not violently slamming a wooden gavel to demand order, and he was not aggressively demanding complex financial answers from the witness, but his quiet, laser-focused narrative style was uniquely, powerfully demanding of everyone's absolute undivided attention. He was slowly, masterfully, and entirely invisibly pivoting the entire moral center of the complex economic argument occurring in the room. He politely acknowledged that greedy corporate bankers were certainly not helping the dire situation, tossing a minor, highly dismissive concession to Waters' earlier explosive points. But he gently, firmly, and unequivocally suggested to the room that Wall Street executives sitting comfortably in their air-conditioned, highly secure glass towers in Manhattan do not actually possess the magical legislative power to instantly devalue the physical paper currency sitting inside a working plumber's worn leather wallet. He began to seamlessly weave a highly complex, devastating macroeconomic reality directly into his simple, folksy, and remarkably accessible story. He started talking directly about the city they were currently sitting in. He talked about Washington, D.C., He talked about massive, incomprehensible, multi-trillion-dollar federal spending bills that were routinely passed in the dead of night, consisting of thousands of unread, highly complex pages, heavily marketed to the unsuspecting American public as necessary, benevolent, and deeply moral charity. There are a whole lot of highly educated, very smart folks operating in this city, Kennedy noted softly, his tone remaining incredibly mild but now heavily laced with a deep, cutting, and profound irony that dripped from every single carefully chosen word. Folks with advanced degrees from elite universities that cost significantly more than Earl's entire house, but sometimes looking directly at the disastrous, highly inflationary legislation that gets highly praised and fiercely defended in this very room, you have to genuinely wonder if their brains have completely packed their bags and gone on a long, permanent vacation. The heavy tension currently hanging in the chamber began to rapidly twist and fundamentally change its entire shape and texture. It was absolutely no longer the explosive, highly confrontational, and aggressive tension heavily generated by Waters just moments prior. It was a slow-building, deeply inescapable, and incredibly heavy pressure that settled over the massive crowd like a thick, suffocating fog rolling in off a dark ocean. It was the distinct, unmistakable tension of a highly effective rhetorical trap, slowly, methodically closing. It was at this precise, highly calculated moment that Senator Kennedy finally moved his right hand slowly toward the small, neglected, and utterly mundane object resting quietly on the polished desk directly in front of him. He picked up the heavily crumpled, yellowing grocery receipt. He smoothed it out carefully with the pad of his thumb, pressing the deep creases flat against the wood and holding it up just slightly in the air so the incredibly sensitive television cameras positioned in the back could perfectly catch the harsh, unmistakable white glare of the cheap, flimsy thermal paper against the dark, imposing wood of the room. He calmly announced to the entirely silent, captivated chamber that he had personally stopped by a local, completely ordinary neighborhood market that very morning before arriving at the Capitol building. He did not reach into his tailored breast pocket to pull out his reading glasses to recite from a thick, heavily researched binder of dense economic forecasts provided by a think tank. He did not quote highly abstract gross domestic product statistics, complex inflation indexes, or obscure fiscal policy papers that absolutely nobody outside of a university academic institution truly understood. Instead, he simply read the literal, undeniable prices printed in faded black ink on the cheap, crumpled receipt he held in his hand. He slowly, methodically read the astronomical cost of a standard dozen of large grade A eggs. He read the shocking, highly inflated price of a single plastic gallon of whole milk. He read the final, devastating total for a simple, ordinary loaf of sliced white bread. Every single number he calmly recited hung incredibly heavily in the dead, silent room. They were not abstract economic theories. They were undeniable, brutal facts of daily survival. Absolutely every single person sitting in the packed public gallery, the highly cynical press box, and even the wealthy politicians sitting comfortably up on the elevated dais knew exactly how much those basic, foundational numbers had skyrocketed entirely out of control over the past 2 agonizing years. They were the specific numbers that dictated reality, the numbers that forced families to make impossible, heartbreaking choices at the dinner table every single night. Kennedy finally lowered the flimsy piece of paper back to the desk, letting it rest gently on the polished wood. He slowly turned his head, pivoting his entire body to look directly down the long, curved wooden table, his gaze locking entirely and exclusively onto Maxine Waters. The sleepy, completely detached and weary Southern demeanor entirely vanished from his eyes in a fraction of a second, instantly replaced by a sharp, brilliant, and deeply piercing clarity that demanded a total, inescapable reckoning. My distinguished colleague from the House just delivered a profoundly passionate, beautifully spoken speech about fiercely protecting the vulnerable working class from the wealthy elite, Kennedy said, his voice suddenly dropping a full octave, entirely losing its breezy, casual quality, and instead carrying a devastating, undeniable, and absolute weight that entirely commanded the massive space. But, Madam, when you relentlessly and endlessly advocate to fire up the federal printing presses, creating massive oceans of new money completely out of thin air to properly fund your political vanity projects disguised to the public as deep compassion, you are the exact person turning Earl's hard-earned, physically exhausting paycheck into absolutely worthless confetti. That terrified corporate banker sitting right there didn't cause the price of this basic milk to double overnight. He didn't print the money. The wildly reckless, completely unchecked spending constantly voted on by your side of the political aisle is the silent, invisible thief that is aggressively picking Earl's pocket every single time he walks into a grocery store just trying to feed his children. The directness, the absolute bluntness, and the completely unvarnished nature of the direct accusation was entirely staggering to witness. It was a brutal, highly precise dismantling of her entire foundational argument, executed not with a chaotic screaming match or a barrage of statistics, but with a piece of literal trash representing the daily suffering of the working class. Waters famously protective of her carefully cultivated political image as the uncompromising champion of the poor, and fundamentally entirely unused to being challenged so brutally and logically without the chaotic protection of a loud overriding shouting match, instantly leaned forward in her chair. Her entire body went incredibly rigid. Her eyes flashed with intense, fiery fury as she reached aggressively, almost desperately, for the metal stem of her microphone, pulling it rapidly toward her face. Her mouth was already opening wide to launch her legendary, incredibly reliable defensive maneuver. The entire room collectively braced itself, holding its breath for the inevitable, explosive, and deafening shout of "reclaiming my time" to shatter the heavy tension. But Kennedy possessed an immaculate, almost supernatural sense of rhetorical timing, highly honed over decades of intense courtroom battles and unforgiving political debates. He saw the aggressive physical interruption coming from a mile away. He actively watched her hand grip the microphone, and he smoothly, effortlessly accelerated his speaking cadence, effectively cutting her off just a microsecond before her vocal cords could even produce a recognizable sound. He leaned his face directly into the black mesh of his microphone, ensuring his voice entirely dominated the audio feed broadcasting to the nation, and delivered a line that would permanently, irrevocably cement the morning's hearing in the absolute annals of modern political history. The pure, unadulterated, and blinding hypocrisy constantly floating around in this chamber today, Kennedy stated with absolute ringing and crystal clarity, his Louisiana drawl sharpening into a perfectly honed, deadly blade, is as crooked as a snake with severe muscle cramps. He completely stopped speaking, severing the audio instantly, and allowing the bizarre, incredibly vivid, and deeply unmistakably Southern metaphor to echo loudly and distinctly off the high marble walls of the historic chamber. It was an image so completely absurd, yet so perfectly, devastatingly descriptive of twisted political logic that it demanded immediate processing from every brain in the room. And the harsh, painful reality of this crushing inflation, he concluded firmly, his eyes locked directly onto her completely shocked, temporarily paralyzed expression, entirely refusing to let her look away or break eye contact, cannot be silenced, cannot be hidden away, and absolutely cannot be reclaimed by simply banging a little piece of wood on a fancy desk. The immediate, overwhelming aftermath of the devastating, highly targeted statement was a profound, stunning, and almost physically heavy silence that descended upon the entire committee. The incredibly colorful, completely unexpected, and disarmingly rural nature of the crooked snake metaphor had entirely short-circuited the standard, highly predictable political outrage machine that usually governed the strict decorum of the room. There was absolutely no parliamentary protocol for responding to it. It took 2 full, agonizingly long seconds for the sheer delightful absurdity and the simultaneously devastating laser-guided accuracy of the rhetorical strike to fully register with a highly cynical, deeply experienced audience. And then, slowly, uncontrollably, originating directly from the densely packed rows of the press gallery at the very back of the room, a distinct sound began to emerge. It was absolutely not a loud, boisterous roar of partisan applause, nor was it a coordinated political cheer. Rather, it was a sudden, completely helpless, collective snort of genuine laughter, the exact type of desperate, bubbling, entirely involuntary laughter that people fiercely try to suppress in highly serious professional environments but fundamentally cannot control, no matter how hard they try. A veteran reporter near the center aisle physically covered his mouth with both hands, his shoulders shaking visibly. A highly paid corporate lobbyist in the third row let out a sharp, surprised guffaw before immediately staring down at his expensive shoes in embarrassment. The stifled, rolling laughter rapidly rippled through the ranks of the political aides and the highly paid consultants, entirely breaking the absolute terrifying aura of authority that Waters had fought so incredibly hard to carefully establish at the very beginning of the hour. Waters sat entirely frozen in her large leather chair, her hand hovering incredibly awkwardly in the dead air directly over her heavy wooden gavel. She looked completely, fundamentally out of her element. The impenetrable, historically reliable defensive shield of her trademark catchphrase had just been rendered entirely publicly useless in front of millions of viewers. She realized instantly in that agonizing, highly public moment of total paralysis that if she dared to shout it now, if she violently struck that gavel while the entire room was actively struggling to contain its laughter over a joke made explicitly at her expense, she would absolutely not look powerful, commanding, or righteous. She would simply pathetically look like the bitter, defeated punchline to Senator Kennedy's incredibly effective, perfectly delivered joke. The intense, aggressive momentum of the room had completely, entirely abandoned her side of the dais, washing away as silently and inevitably as a rapidly receding ocean tide, leaving her stranded and exposed on the beach. She slowly, very carefully pulled her trembling hand back from the microphone, refusing to touch the gavel. She set her jaw tightly in a furious, incredibly rigid line, staring straight ahead at the far wall, but she said absolutely nothing at all. Her profound silence was the loudest, most absolute concession of defeat possible. Down at the completely opposite end of the sprawling, elevated mahogany dais, Senator John Neely Kennedy did not crack even the slightest hint of a triumphant smile. In a city where ambitious politicians practically live to manufacture viral moments and aggressively grandstand for the evening news cameras, his immediate reaction was a masterclass in profound, absolute restraint. He did not arrogantly look around the massive, echoing room to actively acknowledge the suppressed, rolling laughter currently rippling through the crowded press gallery, nor did he make any attempt whatsoever to visibly bask in the warm, satisfying glow of a highly successful, completely devastating rhetorical kill. The heavy television cameras were trained entirely on his face, their operators desperately searching for a smirk, a raised eyebrow, or a victorious nod to his conservative colleagues, but he offered them absolutely nothing of the sort. Operating with the exact same exceptionally slow, highly methodical, and entirely unbothered pacing he had utilized since the morning began, he acted exactly as if the monumental, seismic shift in the room's power dynamic hadn't even occurred. The air was thick with the undeniable reality of Maxine Waters' complete rhetorical defeat, yet Kennedy remained entirely unfazed and firmly grounded. Instead of leaning into the microphone to deliver a final, unnecessary verbal blow, he simply reached his right hand out across the highly polished surface of the desk. His physical movements were incredibly deliberate, completely lacking any residual adrenaline or nervous energy. He quietly picked up the small, crumpled grocery receipt from the dark wood. His fingers handled the cheap, faded thermal paper with an unexpected, almost reverent gentleness, While the entire chamber watched in captivated, breathless silence, he carefully, deliberately folded the crumpled paper precisely in half, pressing the sharp crease flat with his thumb. He folded it exactly once more, taking his absolute time, making the piece of paper incredibly small and deeply compact. Then, with a quiet, deliberate motion, he slipped it deep into the inside breast pocket of his impeccably tailored suit jacket. In doing so, he tucked the harsh, undeniable economic reality of the American working class safely away, resting it directly right next to his heart. Demonstrating a quiet, almost exaggerated, and distinctly Southern courtesy, he slowly reached his hand out toward the center of the table. He grasped the heavy, sweating crystal carafe, the ice cubes clinking softly against the thick glass, a tiny, sharp sound that was easily picked up by his active microphone. He poured himself a small glass of ice water, watching the clear liquid fill the tumbler with absolute focus. He lifted the glass, took a very slow, highly refreshing sip, and then gently set the glass back down without making a sound. He sat entirely back in the deep cushions of his large leather chair, exhaling a quiet breath, and laced his fingers together comfortably over his stomach. He had completely, fundamentally altered the entire sweeping reality of the massive congressional hearing using absolutely nothing more than a simple, grounded story about a fictional plumber and a worthless piece of trash retrieved from a local grocery store checkout lane. By the time the highly flustered, entirely overwhelmed committee chairman nervously cleared his exceptionally dry throat, the sheer futility of his position was painfully obvious to every single person remaining in the cavernous room. He leaned forward, grasping his heavy wooden gavel with sweaty palms, and struck the sounding block in a desperate, ultimately fruitlessly optimistic attempt to restore formal legislative order. The sharp crack of the wood echoed hollowly, a weak and pathetic sound against the massive, invisible tectonic shift that had just fundamentally and permanently altered the atmosphere of the chamber. He stammered slightly, attempting to move the session along to the next waiting lawmaker on the official docket, but he was merely going through the motions of a script that had already been entirely shredded. The room no longer belonged to the scheduled agenda. It belonged entirely to the heavy, suffocating aftermath of the exchange that had just transpired. Simultaneously, far beyond the heavily guarded, marble-clad walls of the Capitol building, the digital internet had already taken complete, overwhelming, and merciless possession of the moment. Long before the chairman's gavel even fell for the second time, the clean, high-definition, unedited video clip of the quiet, devastatingly effective Southern takedown had been ripped from the live congressional broadcasting feeds. It was already rapidly spreading like an uncontrollable, ferociously hungry digital wildfire across every single server, router, and fiber optic cable in the nation. It was being rapidly downloaded by eager political commentators, perfectly clipped by savvy social media managers, heavily captioned with bold, unmissable text, and shared endlessly across every major digital platform. Within mere minutes, the footage was trending at the #1 spot across global networks. Thousands of users were already utilizing the audio, dissecting the pacing, and reacting to the sheer absurdity of the confrontation. It was clearly, undeniably destined to loop endlessly on millions of glowing smartphone screens across the country, viewed in crowded subway cars, quiet office cubicles, and bustling suburban coffee shops long before the sun even began to set over the Potomac River. The sheer, terrifying velocity of the internet had instantly transformed a localized political skirmish into an inescapable nationwide cultural phenomenon. In the blazing heat of this unprecedented viral explosion, the original nominal purpose of the hearing was entirely incinerated. The massive, deeply structural and highly technical arguments regarding complex corporate banking regulations were gone. The intricate, densely academic macroeconomic theories debated by Ivy League economists, the tedious, heavily vetted legal jargon carefully prepared by armies of corporate defense attorneys, and the granular discussions about federal interest rates were entirely, completely forgotten by the American public. all the thick leather binders filled with meticulously researched data, all the prepared opening statements, and all the billions of dollars of theoretical financial policy were instantly rendered completely irrelevant. The public had absolutely no interest in the esoteric mechanics of high finance when they had just been handed a perfectly distilled moment of pure, understandable human drama. All that ultimately remained in the collective cultural consciousness. The absolutely only things that truly survived the massive, highly funded, and exhaustively planned spectacle of that morning's congressional hearing were three distinct, unforgettable elements. The first was the stark, undeniable visual image of a crushed, cheap, yellowing grocery store receipt. That fragile piece of thermal paper had been instantly elevated from a piece of forgotten pocket trash into a profound universal symbol of the agonizing daily struggle of the American working class. The second was the highly enduring, hilarious, and perfectly delivered echo of a uniquely Southern insult regarding a cramped snake. It was a bizarre, colorful, and brilliantly disarming phrase that completely shattered the sterile, manufactured outrage of standard Washington rhetoric, ensuring it would be quoted around kitchen tables for decades to come. And finally, the third and most powerful surviving element was the heavy, incredibly profound, and absolutely undeniable silence. It was the crushing, absolute silence of a political giant who had built an entire legendary career on the sheer, unstoppable volume of her voice, but who had finally, unequivocally been rendered completely and utterly speechless. In that final, resonant silence, the brutal, unvarnished simplicity of the truth had won a total, unquestioned victory, echoing far louder than any carefully planned political speech ever could.